Today, in the Australian society, the Australian people are granted the right to decide which people to vote in and which people to vote out of the parliamentary system. They can do this regardless of their gender, wealth, but there are age restrictions that apply. You have to be 18 years or over. In 1901, Australia used to be divided into 6 different colonies. Each colony had its own parliament, its own flag, and its own army. The Imperial Parliament that was located in London had all control over the British colonies. It also had control over the 6 colonies in Australia.
Voting turnouts fell from 77.7% of the population voting in 1917 to 57.9% in the 1922 election. The government was worried because they didn't think that 57.9% was a true representation of who the public wanted as their Prime Minister.
As each of the colonies was governed by different people, it had different laws under which people were entitled or unentitled to vote. This sometimes was dependent upon where the person lived. In the year of 1865, South Australia was the first nation to select their first set of parliamentary members. Although at this time people were allowed to vote, it was not compulsory to enrol and vote. Back then, there were only a small amount of demographic men who were allowed to vote in South Australia. Back then, they were required to be over 21 years of age. As well as having to be 21 years of age, you had to have a certain amount of property possessions. This meant that mostly only the wealthy people were the ones who were allowed to vote. Unlike today, where the citizens of Australia allows all people to vote, that the voting prior to the Federation was dependent on the interest in that person's land. Handed down from the British electoral tradition, an individual who owned property of a certain value in more than one electoral district was entitled to vote in each of those districts. This was known back then as the plural voting system, which was eventually abolished and renamed the one-man, one-vote policy. This meant that in the year of 1905, the whole country was one nation, although it took Queensland a few more years to become part of the nation. Compulsory voting is a system in which the people are forced to vote. If a person does not attend a vote, they will be punished. This can include fine, community service, or even a prison sentence. This can only happen if the fine is not paid or the community service is not up to scratch.
The preferential voting system is the 1, 2, 3, 4 voting system, where the voter gets to select their first, second, third and fourth preferences. The candidate is awarded votes for how many number of 1, 2s and 3s and 4s they acquire. The arguments for introducing compulsory voting were that it would be a true representation of the public. This was the main reason it was introduced. Other arguments included that the candidates could concentrate their arguments on a particular topic, instead of trying to convince people to actually attend the election and vote for them. Voting also teaches people the benefit of political participation, and it should be done every time and be as important as tax and education. In July 1924, compulsory voting was allowed in Australia. In the 1925 federal election, which also acted as a trial for compulsory voting leapt from 57.9% to 91.3%. This made the government relieved and happy because they knew that they had acquired a true representation of who the public wanted as their Prime Minister. However, there was no change to Prime Minister at the 1925 election. Compulsory and preferential voting links to where we live today because these processes are still in place and new to every local, state and federal election. It also links as it makes times around elections so much easier because the candidates do not have to spend their time convincing someone to go, instead making speeches about reasons why people should vote for them. In conclusion, compulsory and preferential voting was a very successful idea, which is still used today. This shows how important the 1920s were to Australia, and how some things that happened back then can still affect